My name is Greg Brown. I'm a senior analyst with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. We welcome those of you joining in Australia, in the United States, and from elsewhere to this evening's or this morning's webinar, depending on where you might be. We're very glad that you could join us, and particularly happy to have the lineup that we have for our discussion this evening. A couple of housekeeping items for everybody before we begin. Let you know what's going to happen tonight. We have about an hour on this platform. We do look forward to comments and questions from those of you joining in from elsewhere. But to begin, what we'll do is have our authors of our report, who I'll introduce in just a moment, speak to us about the report, their findings, and some of their recommendations. Then we have a lineup of three discussants, whom I will introduce a little bit later, to talk about that report and other things which may be missing from this report or where we should be looking to next. We'll have a short discussion amongst all our participants, and then we're going to open things up for those of you who are joining online. You'll notice that on the screen, you can only see those of us who are participating at ASPI and are invited discussants. Your cameras are off, your mics are off. However, you are encouraged to participate. You may use the chat function to send a question or a comment. We do have somebody who is monitoring that now. He's able to filter those. And when we get to the Q&A portion of our event, we'll go ahead and post those for our speakers and make sure to get responses to you. So again, thank you for joining us this evening for what we think will be a terrific discussion about Australia and Indonesia, the Defense and Security Partnership. The rest of the report title, many of you have already seen that because we've sent it to you, is Overcoming Asymmetric Aspirations to Tackle Common Threats. Our authors will remind us here in a moment exactly how long it's been since ASPI's had a report of this length and size and scope on this particular relationship, one that's come out at a particularly vital time, considering the importance of this relationship. We've invited the American audience to participate tonight as well, because we don't want to leave out the other leg of that triangle and of that stool, knowing that there are many people in the DC area and beyond who are also very curious about where the relationship between Australia and Indonesia might be headed and what is the role or possible role for the United States in that. So what I'd like to do is turn the time over to, again, our authors. That's our two authors, Euan and Gatra. They're here. You've seen their bios. I'm going to give them each about 5 minutes to speak. Please take as much time as you like, but not more than 10. Because we do want to make sure we get to the discussion, and we do want to make sure that those who are joining in are able to get their questions on the table. So again, we consider this a brief summary of the report. We encourage you right now, and certainly when we're done, to go online, download it, read it online, whichever is easiest for you. Check out the full report. It's chock-a-block full of good recommendations and a lot of hints about where the relationship should be going next. And so without further ado, I'm going to step back and turn the time over to my colleague, Gatra.
Right, well, thanks so much, Greg, and good morning from Canberra, everyone. Let me just at the outset thank ASPI USA, Pat and Greg, for organizing this webinar, and also extend my deepest appreciation to Fitriani, to Natalie, to John for taking the time to also review the report and then joining us in this conversation as well. Euan and I are super excited to be launching this report, Australia-Indonesia Defense and Security Partnership, Overcoming Asymmetric Aspirations to Tackle Common Threats. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I hope it's an enjoyable report. In this presentation, I'll sort of talk about some of the equities of the defense relationship from the Indonesian side, and then I'll pass it over to you, and we'll talk more about the perspective from the Australian side. But before going into it too deeply, I think I do want to give a bit of a background. And the report really, I think, in many ways came out of conversations that myself, the Fitriani, Euan, and many others at ASPI have had on the subject of Australia-Indonesia defense relations. I think in many ways we are experiencing, again, a period of sustained good ties, both in multiple sets of domains: economic, political, defense, and so on. And a defense cooperation agreement, which came out about just around a year ago, is an example of that. But we wanted to think about how this defense relationship can sort of progress at a time of deepening strategic competition. And it's been repeated over and over again, I think, within the commentary space, that in many ways, despite being close neighbors, despite having comprehensive strategic partnerships and so on, Australia and Indonesia do see the world slightly differently. There is an agreement that the Indo-Pacific region is going through a period of flux. There is an agreement that the rise of China poses some security challenges. There is an agreement that there is a preference as well that the United States stays engaged in the Pacific, but both Australia and Indonesia have approached the issue very differently. Of course, Australia has sort of doubled down in that security relationship with the United States, especially since the AUKUS arrangement, whereas Indonesia has remained committed to a position of non-alignment. It's been open to deepening its engagements with the US, with China, with Russia, with Australia, and many other countries. So there's oftentimes this conversation about strategic divergences. So what can we see beyond that? Managing these strategic differences obviously requires a lot of realism and mutual respect. And it was with this in mind that we conducted this research. That said, despite the strategic divergences, as I've said before, the relationship is in a fairly good place. I think from the Indonesian perspective, Australia is brought very positively. President Prabowo is, I think, a big fan of the relationship with Australia, especially the defense dimensions. He tends to be very critical sometimes of Western countries, especially those in Europe. But Australia tends to have a fairly, he tends to have a more fonder views of Australia compared to other places in the West. Defense is, of course, a priority for President Prabowo, especially given his defense background. He was defense minister as well. Military modernization has been a priority, but also expanding those global partnerships. I mean, we see this defense ties deepening with France, for example, with South Korea. The 2024 DCA sort of, I think, aligns with these ambitions as well. It offers Indonesia practical access to things like training and operational exposure that ultimately supports the military's transformation and capabilities development agenda. And on the DCA specifically, speaking to our friends in Indonesia in the defense space, there's deep appreciation that I think the DCA is in a way an elevation of the defense relationship, although I think realistically they also see it largely as a legal and administrative update to what is already a fairly comprehensive defense relationship anyway. Our defense friends in Indonesia have highlighted that one of the main interests in the DCA come from, for example, access to training grounds in Northern Australia. There's interest in these areas because of their advanced infrastructure, of geographical proximity. They provide a natural environment for practical, high-quality engagement. In a sense, the DCA has become a tool not just for relationship building, but also from the Indonesian perspective, real capability development. Now, while the DCA itself doesn't cover issues like visa, easing visa delays and so on, a lot of Indonesian defense officials have also informed us that part of the value of the DCA, especially given that it gives legal and administrative protection to the defense relationship, is that it does provide some easing of operational procedures, especially for Indonesian defense officials to engage with, to come to Australia. So in other words, it just makes it easier to get a visa, for example, a lot quicker in comparison to the past. Of course, there are still many challenges that remain. I mean, the DCA, I think, in many ways opens up opportunities for extended defense collaboration in areas like defense industry, sciences, military medicine, and so on. There is progress in these areas, but I think still very much constrained by a wide variety of factors. Defense industry, for example, is still not meeting any, the levels that the aspirations on both sides, I guess, in a way, given things like content requirements on the Indonesian side. So there are a few issues still here and there, but nonetheless, I think overall the DCA is welcomed very much from the Indonesian defense community. Now, one area that I think is of potential that we think of potential growth is in collaboration on countering hybrid threats, which are broadly defined as activities that combine military, non-military practices employed by states and non-states below the conventional warfare. Now, the strategic logic behind this recommendation comes from the fact that I think hybrid threats are just becoming a lot more common in Indo-Pacific. I mean, beyond that, great powers, at a time, again, of deepening strategic competition, great powers and even other kinds of powers are increasingly more incentivized to use all instruments of natural power to secure strategic gains. And this includes, cyber power, information power, and so on, right? But at the same time, I do recognize that I think in a way, it may come across as somewhat of an interesting proposal. why hybrid threats cooperation? Because I think on the one hand, hybrid threats cooperation has not really been at the forefront of the agenda for both Australia and Indonesia. On the other hand, hybrid threats cooperation comes across, at the end of the day, when we talk about hybrid threats, oftentimes they do relate to certain powers that we may not be comfortable talking about. From the Australian side, of course, it could include countries like China. From the Indonesian side, it could include countries like China and the US. So could there really be collaboration in space, right? It's sort of one of the things we ask. But yet, in my view anyway, I think many of the building blocks of hybrid threat cooperation, like cybersecurity, maritime security, counterterrorism, and so on, are already present within the bilateral agenda. I think there is growing awareness that these issues span traditional silos. They shouldn't just be focused in individual domains. And I think it would be good to see a more integrated response. So I think a dedicated focus on hybrid threats allows us to sort of create coherence, allows us to create coordination and build resilience in, I think, multiple dimensions and domains, across all of these areas. So it does also reflect the reality that hybrid threats being hybrid, they also operate normally in several different kinds of domains at the same time. Beyond that, and this would be a next step kind of thing, it allows for technical cooperation through joint exercises, intelligence and information sharing, and the priority, in my view, dialogues between both civil and military forces, without requiring any overt alignment. And plus, they don't have to be country specific. I think at the end of the day, it's all about building resilience in multiple domains. Of course, there are natural sensitivities that we must pay attention to. I mean, we have to approach this with care and clarity. This means that I think, especially with the political situation in Indonesia, this means that hybrid threat cooperation shouldn't just involve the military. It should involve, multiple sectors as well, especially the civilian sector. Given the nature of hybrid threats, I think it makes sense to involve entities and agencies like Home Affairs and so on anyway. So it must be an inclusive process, and that's why we're pushing ahead we're calling for a track 1.5 process to kick off this whole conversation that could involve the civilian community as well. I think I've probably spoken more than I should have. Various popped up on the screen again, so I might now pass it on to you. And
thanks very much, Gatra. Good morning to the Australian participants. Good evening to the US-based participants. My thanks also to Greg and colleagues for facilitating this launch and discussion. Just briefly, by way of background to the report, it's been some time since ASPI has put something out on Indonesia that's defense related. We have another one on climate, but I think that we were trying to fill that gap in the awareness that a lot of the command signals we get from the Australian government, and we are, I should say, partially funded by the Department of Defence, and I would include defence within this, is for more analysis and product that is Southeast Asia facing. I don't claim to be an Indonesia expert myself. My background is in Southeast Asian studies. There are many people who are far more credentialed on this call than I am. So the recommendations and analysis we set out is very much from our own point of view, and I should say I have some humility about that. I'm very much interested in this being a two-way discussion and the feedback from our distinguished respondents. Why is Indonesia important to Australia? Well, sometimes it's obvious, but we should say the obvious things. It's a large and very close neighbour. And for that reason, it's in a category, I think, of its own. When it comes to Southeast Asian relationships, the geography does not change. For all that, I think I'll just try and say a couple of things rather than regurgitating the nuts and bolts of the report, which I think most of you have read, just to frame it at a higher level and in historical context. And I think that my observation is there's a lot of symbolism that freights Australia's relationship with Indonesia, and this can be both good and bad. I think it particularly operates at the political level, and this means that certain constructs get projected onto the partnership. For example, to do with Australia's identity within Asia, or another example, the notion that Indonesia can be the independent ally alternative to the United States and others, or thirdly, that Indonesia can be our major economic partner in future. Now, none of these are impossible, but I think they're unlikely, and we need to sort of aim off from some of that political symbolism that gets freighted into the relationship. Conversely, I think the same is true, that Australia's fear of geographical isolation as a European outpost, which has sort of dominated a lot of Australian thinking about its place in the region, has also tended to inflate threat perceptions towards Indonesia. I think the challenge really is to find a balance between these two different impulses. And I think that the sort of contrary nature of that in some ways explains the roller coaster pattern of relations between Australia and Indonesia. And one of the things that we observe in the report is one of the best indicators that things are on a better track is the relative stability over the last decade. There hasn't really been a crisis that has fundamentally threatened the long-term trajectory of improved cooperation. I think also it was an interesting experience to write with Gatra, both Gatra being Indonesian and also having I think a positive view of the relationship. I'm probably more the glass half empty view, and it was an interesting sort of iterative experience to get my pessimism challenged in a constructive way by Gatra, and I think I did wind up as a result in a more positive place. And I think the hybrid threat recommendation, which Dr. Fitriani also played a hand in, I think is a useful one for how to take the relationship forward. But again, in historical perspective, I think it really does need to be underlined that the relationship is in a much, much better place than it has been over the broad course of history. Australian soldiers were fighting Indonesian soldiers in the middle of the 1960s in Borneo. In the late 90s, we were worrying at the same time about the breakup of the Republic of Indonesia and the prospect during the Timor crisis that there would actually be blows traded again between the ADF and the TNI, and that's not that long ago. And I think it really is worth underlining just how significant that improvement in the relationship has been. Obviously, it has its limits, but even the other crises that have periodically occurred, for example, the post 9/11 preoccupation with terrorist threats, also helped to drive the relationship to forge close links, not just at the defense level, but between the intelligence organizations of both countries, which has acted, I think, as a useful source of ballast since then. In terms of, to bring it sort of back to the nuts and bolts of the report, and I think Australia's equities are no surprise. Australia wants a strong and stable Indonesia that can defend itself. That's something we point out in the report. It is also a neighbour-to-neighbour relationship at a very fundamental level. Australia and Indonesia have the longest maritime boundary in the world. So that obviously is a major policy interest, and to get maritime security working, not just in a sort of regional security level, but in the core interests of both countries to make sure that there is stability between them. And I think the hybrid threats also picks up a segment of that maritime security threat set. That said, Australia also has a strategic interest in accessing Indonesia's sea and airspace to transit through it. That's always been the case. Australia defines its defence perimeter all the way up to the Malay Peninsula. So there's nothing new in that. But I think AUKUS and the onus that we've seen in recent defence planning documents, which puts the emphasis on power projection and on long-range strike, and the AUKUS submarines has underlined that. And that's also rubbed up against some of those tensions in the relationship. Indonesia is an archipelagic state. It owns its sea and airspace. International law guarantees access for Australia and other countries to pass through it in a regulated manner. But nonetheless, I think that sense that you've got geopolitical tensions and military assets passing through is something that is increasing. And I think there's been an interesting attempt to sort of try and decouple that from the positives of the Defence Cooperation Agreement, which doesn't deal with those more sensitive areas, but we should certainly be aware of them in our background to how things are more broadly progressing in the strategic relationship. Finally, just to underline, in addition to the hybrid threats recommendation, there is a specific recommendation in there that the Philippines be brought into the exercise cycle between Indonesia and Australia, which is quite a brisk one. I mean, I think there are about 20 exercises of various kinds that take place on average every year. And there are some new ones that have recently been proposed in the island of Morotai, which we flagged in the report. And our challenge to the relationship on both sides was to be ambitious about bringing in the Philippines as a third party, not necessarily in a large scale or even a formal way, but as a way to test the margins of that relationship and what can be done in terms of strategic shared interests. That may be a difficult sell in Jakarta, and I think it's really on the Australian side to sort of try and gently push for that as far as possible. And I'm happy to come back to that in detail. But enough from me, and look forward to our respondents. Back to you, Greg.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have to say, both Gatra and Euan, I'm particularly pleased to hear this approach, having the co-authors. You always do wonder with co-authors whether they came in with the same mind and decided just to rate the piece together, or two very different minds and two very different approaches. I think you have the stronger approach, and it is good to have one optimist, one's pessimist, one who thinks very broadly, and one who can do that, but also look at some of the particulars. I think this is the strength of this report as well. I think others will see that too. As I mentioned earlier, we do have three discussants to talk about this very interesting, provocative, and I think very timely report by Drs. Priyandita and Graham. So we're going to go in order, and the order is going to be to start with Dr. Fitriani, who's also our colleague at ASPI. Dr. Fitriani is a senior analyst. She sits with our cyber technology and security program, but don't be fooled. She does a whole lot more than just that program. She is a specialist in a number of foreign policy issues and non-traditional security issues across Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And after we hear from Dr. Fitriani, we'll turn to Brigadier John Gould. He's well known to many of you in the defense establishment, certainly those in the Australian Army, for all things Australian military and Indonesian military, still involved in that space and still serving at that rank of Brigadier. He's lucky, for those of you in Australia, he's not down in cold Canberra or Melbourne. He's enjoying his winter in Brisbane. And after we hear from John, we'll have an opportunity, and we're especially glad we're able to have and hear from Natalie Sambhi. She joins us from Verve Research, which most of you know is an independent think tank which focuses on relationships between militaries and societies in Southeast Asia. And I believe she's also a non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institution here in Washington, D.C. So again, really glad to have all three of you join us, and we'll give you each about 5 or 6 minutes. So, Fitriani.
Oh, thanks, Greg. Now the mic's on. Congratulations, Euan, Gatra, for the publication of your report. I think the paper is refreshingly realistic and not shying away from the asymmetric aspiration between Australia and Indonesia with the differing capabilities, as well as perhaps different way of looking at the bilateral relationship. You can be very pessimistic about it, and you can be very optimistic about it. But I'm glad that we met in the middle, and actually saying that the Defense Cooperation Agreement last year is not really a breakthrough, but a building block that is substantial and helpful in recalibrating expectation and assert the commitment of building capability. Now, maybe so I can deliver my point in time. I welcome the raise of opportunity to collaborate on hybrid threats. However, both the term of hybrid threats is not commonly used in the region, as well as by Indonesia and Australia. Countries most commonly use gray zone tactic and non-traditional security for the fear of being perceived as the threat to contain China. And economically, that's not a viable term. So how do you go about it? Secondly, as you rightly mentioned, these corporations need to take into note the asymmetric capability, especially in Indonesia's side. There's a limited and growing, maybe I can say growing, still developing cyber and information and governance architecture that the coordination are quite fragmented. How does Indonesia, whether Australia be patient enough to manage that? I think it's interesting. There are low-hanging fruit of cooperation that we can work on together, like Euan said about the maritime. Both countries are quite sensitive of the maritime crime, such as illegal fishing, previously piracy, and others. But in other areas, perhaps we can actually bolster the interest of learning more of issue of disinformation. That is not new. Issues of protection of critical infrastructure that I think is important for both, especially Indonesia is trying to grow is digital infrastructure. And maybe I end with maybe two questions. The first is, the paper is quite aware that Indonesia is also being actively courted by other major power, which include Russia and China. So given the long-standing commitment of Indonesia, bebas aktif, free and independent foreign policy, and the interest of increasingly diversifying defense partnership and increasing to showcase Indonesia's strategic autonomy. How do you think that Indonesia would prioritize deeper collaboration with Australia? At this point, what are the concrete incentive, political, operational, and capacity-based, perhaps, that make Australia a particularly attractive partner for Indonesia, for Jakarta eyes, beyond the existing and historical geographic ties? Secondly, Euan, you mentioned about bringing in the Philippines, but given that Indonesia already have trilateral, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines on working on maritime countering privacy and transnational crime in the Sulu and Celebes Sea. What strategic rationale you think would compel Jakarta again to support this trilateral proposal between Australia, Philippines, and Indonesia, especially considering Indonesia is more cautious when it comes to encountering China? I think that's a question for me. Thank you, Greg.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Before we get answers to those questions, let's move on. John, could we hear from you?
Thanks very much, Greg, and thanks authors and people watching the webinar. I recognise lots of people's names here, and there's lots of expertise paying attention to this report. So well done, both Gatra and Euan. I'll just say this: The report, as somebody who's done a little bit of this work in the past, is well researched. I think you've spoken to the right people, got the right genuine inputs. A lot of those people are practitioners, so that's fantastic. It doesn't gild the lily, which I think is brilliant as well, and I don't think we'd expect anything different from ASPI. You've got a reputation for being very frank and hard-nosed, so well done. This contributes to that body of work. This is very timely because the Defence Cooperation Agreement is topical. Once it's ratified, this has the effect of international legal weight. It is a treaty. So it's right that we ask ourselves, what's this going to change? What's the opportunities? What's going to emerge? In reality, this is probably a DCA minus versus a DCA or a DCA plus. All the clever people who've worked hard to generate it will say that there's little bits missing out of it because they were too hard to resolve at this point. So as your report rightly identifies, Gatra and Euan, it doesn't have status of forces prescriptions in very detailed ways that some other DCAs would be, etc. So the fact that this DCA is coming, both bureaucracies are working on it, notwithstanding ratification has to follow, but because this thing's emerging, it's critical that there's a lot of voices reflecting on what it means. So well done for writing this report. And your points are well made about the relationship being at a historical high at the moment. It absolutely is. Whether there's causation or correlation, I was one of the people doing the work where we had our last bad moment, 2014, wiretapping, 2015, excuse me, Chancellor Sukumaran. And it's been a long time, 2017, perhaps with Gatra Namaja and the Langs West issue was the last sort of blip. If you look at what exercise Karis Woomera was last year and Talisman Sabre just gone, malaria research happening now, Army helicopter aviation relationships. There's so much volume and diversity now in the relationship. It's quite amazing. We have to remember that's got a lot to do with the fact that there's a very interesting human being called Prabowo Subianto, who had been the Defence Minister, who has a national first penchant for international relations. He's very atypical. Remembering as a teenager, he lived in Europe. His English is fantastic. He understands Indonesia very well from being outside of Indonesia. And as we all know, we know our countries best when we go away from them and look back. Prabowo did that. Prabowo also spent a month of his life as a young man, 1974, living at RMC Duntroon. On the first UCMIL exchange, one of his good cadet mates with him at the time was a man by the name of Shafri Shamsuddin. Shafri, of course, now is the Minister for Defence. So we've got a very amazing circumstance whereby a very internationalist, now President, previous Defence Minister, and in the time as Defence Minister, he had a lot of freedom of action. My assertion is that we've got a Defence Cooperation agreement in prospect because of Prabowo Subianto. Australia's eternal optimism bias has met an individual with the strategic desires to meet some of our optimism. And lo and behold, the document's emerging, which is fantastic. Just a couple of reflections on the nature of the relationship, just to reinforce the points about your pragmatism in this report. And I'd just say if I was the author, which fortunately I'm not, because John Blackstone could attest that I'm very slow and ponderous at writing, but I might have called this report Maximising Benefits, Minimising Problems, because really, as adjacent neighbours, and we're both in the G20, we're going to have a security relationship. Unlike Australia with Poland, where we don't have to have a security relationship, and we don't, you must have a security relationship with all your neighbours. It just comes with the way the world works, geopolitics, etc. And then it's up to the participants whether that's a bad, a neutral, or a good relationship. And I think we've seen all points of that compass with Australia and Indonesia. But the point is we're incredibly relevant to each other because we are large and we are proximate. maximising benefits, minimising problems is really what both parties should be upholding as our symbol. Of course, you've called out in the report the different aspirations in the relationship. That's very true. Australia is an entity that embraces alliances. We love throwing around the partnership word. Australia would consider Indonesia a partner. Indonesia would consider Australia a sahabat, daripada mitra, right? So in all my time sitting in seminars, dealing with Indonesian senior officers, etc., you always hear the words friend, sahabat. You very rarely hear the word mitra or kemitraan, because getting too close is anathema to what Indonesia wants. Indonesia wants those omnidirectional relationships with everybody, seeking mutual benefit, but also seeking to maintain strategic autonomy. So Australia needs to remember, notwithstanding we've got a really strong alliance mindset. We've had that since the Boer War, and since Indonesia is the antithesis of that. Australia ultimately, I tell people, is, from an Indonesian perspective, looks like an offence force, because we have a history of fighting beyond our territory and against threats to our interests, rarely so threats to the Australian people or the Australian homeland. Indonesia looks a lot more like a defence force. It fights at home. It only ever goes overseas for Chapter 6 UN operations. And its mindset is we can only rely on ourselves. That is the Indonesian mindset. It's post-colonial, it's real. So we are very different entities, as you've called out in the report. The other challenges, of course, it's always PRC and US calculus. Any greater closeness with Australia is looked at from that prism. In Jakarta, we've got to live with that. We understand the challenges of resourcing, which this DCA, whilst creates the capacity for more work, at the end of the day, you need people, money and time to do any more work. Indonesia's got 10 billion US getting spent on its defence interest per year. Australia's got about 40 billion US. There's an inequity in the amount of money we've got to spend. If you want to do more, somebody's got to spend more. I'll leave that as an open statement for those people who write checks in the relationship. You do need people, you do need time. Indonesia is courted by many, as Fitriani has called out, and Indonesia's time looks a little bit more stressed than Australia's time. You also need staff to run the relationship. And I do call out and remind ourselves that Indonesia still does not have an Australia relationship desk at Chilankup or at the Kemhan building. Australia does. The only place you can find an Australia desk in Indonesia is at Bais, right? And of course, Australia's got one of those, I think, in DIO, but we've also got people on the other side of the relationship trying to make things happen. So there's a little bit of a resource challenge. We've got gatekeepers in our relationship. Australia's Deco exports, Indonesia's Bais. So we know we've got these sort of challenges, notwithstanding. We've got Prabowo on our side. We've got optimism buyers in Australia. And these small challenges will be wrangled by clever guys and girls doing the relationship at the moment. I notice our colleague Jessica, who's on the on this webinar at the moment, she's one of those ladies who'll do the work, I'm sure. Can I just reflect on a couple of your words before I finish up? Differing aspirations and strategic outlooks. You wrote in your report, absolutely. You also wrote that the defence relationship has been an anchor for intergovernmental relations. It certainly has at points. And I'll just remind everybody that militaries, if they're not fighting wars, are sitting around doing training, right? Militaries are designed to train. And always refreshing new faces in new technologies. And as a consequence, militaries will generally want to do training anywhere they can and with anybody they can as well. So that's just a great thing about militaries. Unlike a nation's health service workers, they're busy every day delivering health services to people in need, right? Militaries tend to be sitting around in barracks and or training when there's no wars on, right? So this is why militaries are great entities for cooperation, because generally you've got the need to work and spare time. And in my experience as an infantryman, That's the case, and Indonesia's experience of infantrymen. You don't sometimes need a strategic rationale to work together. You just need a boss and some resources that said, go away and practice how to do jungle fighting. And the two communities will do it enthusiastically. They don't need a strategic threat to face. They just know, hey, I've got to do some training, and this time I'm doing it in Queensland. That's fantastic. So as long as somebody says yes and pays the bills, this relationship could be very big without having to have the clever hybrid threat sort of rationale. Remember, militaries just need to train and practice and often don't need that logic. You do need, though, authority, and you do need resources. On your policy recommendations, I love the idea that you've got to the stuff that we're currently not doing very well, and that is real-world hybrid threats that we face now. I love the prescriptions. 1.5 track's always easy. A combined task force would make sense. And of course, then focus on doing some work, training and exercises. All I'd flag to you is that generally you need somebody to be a champion in Australia and a champion in Indonesia to both want to do the cooperation and own the problem. For hybrid threats, the challenge we have is who owns the problems in both countries. So in my experience, it was very easy for Panglimas and Chiefs of Defence Force to see each other as equivalents and know that they've got to have a strong relationship together and make stuff happen. Prime ministers and presidents, where you've got this equivalence between two invested individuals who take ownership for their portfolio, they will direct traffic. The issue with hybrid threats is where there's no clear ownership of the problem, you get no, you might have, for example, the counter-terrorism thematic, which has been pretty good as a bonder for Indonesia and Australia for the last number of years. Australian Attorney Generals, Australian AFP, was it military? It's always been a little bit of a bitzer. And in a way from Indonesia, it's been the same. So all I'd say is the hybrid stuff is very prospective because it's real, but finding the right champions in both Jakarta and Canberra is the magic sauce that needs to be resolved. And the reason why these things don't exist at the moment, and you're suggesting them, is because they don't occur naturally out of themselves, in and of themselves. Finally, a point on maritime security, considering a bit of work there, considering the Philippines. I think you're right to say Jakarta would look at this curiously. Notwithstanding Jakarta, Malaysia, Philippines have got both land border and maritime border trilateral patrols and activities in the past. They're all adjacent, and they're dealing with the post-Marawi world and evidence of maritime insecurity on their trilateral borders. So Australia, Philippines and Indonesia, whilst in Canberra we might think that we've got some common ground, I would say that would be a very hard sell in Jakarta. If it was me and I had a lot of money, I'd be saying, stuff that, let's build an Arafura Centre for Maritime Safety and Security in Darwin. I'd invite the Timorese, I'd invite the Papua New Guineans, I'd invite the Indonesians. If I had enough money, I'd build it all as an Australian, and I'd pay for everybody to be there. And I would do what the JC LEC in Semarang has done, or the Maritime Fusion Centre in Singapore has done, and that is you've got a host entity who builds a place with a focus. It's both schoolhouse and a bit of a monitoring type location, but somebody's got to pay the bills. And in my case here, if Australia wanted more with Indonesia and wanted a strong rationale for something which would be a minilateral and hybrid, that's what I'd be doing. Arafura Centre for Maritime Safety and Security, build it in Darwin. Australia, build the building, build the IT, work out how many bums on seats you need, invite our colleagues, not just from defence, but anybody who does maritime safety and security from those other nations, and I'd do that, right? I don't think people in Jakarta would say this is nonsense or we can't find the money to show up. As long as Australia's paying the bills, that's the thing I'd be doing instead of trying to get the Philippine stuff going. All right, that's my supposed 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We appreciate those insights, the comments. Dr. Sambhi.
Thanks very much, Greg. Terima kasih semua for your time this morning. Selamat pagi dan selamat malam. Always very difficult to come after John Gould. I always like to hear what John has to say, and I could easily let him talk for an hour. What I would like to do then, rather than look at some of the brilliant recommendations that John has suggested, I'd like to take it up a level and abstract to look at what the societal and political context, the concerns that we may have when we're looking at expanding this security relationship. So I think I agree that this is an opportune time, now that we have this DCA in progress, to revisit what areas that we may expand within the relationship, but also may pay some attention to, well, what might the political and societal challenges be? And the first one that I want to start with is looking at the broader societal context in Indonesia, and looking at, if we're looking at things like hybrid threats, what attention might we have to pay to the way in which the media landscape in places like Indonesia is changing, the way in which the media can be a driver or a vector for hybrid threats, but the way in which that is being managed, but also impacted by government policy in Indonesia. How might that be more conducive for Australia to work together with Indonesian authorities, or how might that be more challenging if the Indonesian authorities themselves are not allowing freedom of space, freedom of conversation, and freedom of criticism on platforms which is inherently in a democratic context? So I think that's the first one to consider. The second one is looking back in Australia's own domestic context. Is any sense of resistance to deepening cooperation with the TNI? There have been many friction points between our bilateral security relationship, which have been in the past, but that doesn't mean that there aren't certain areas that will cause friction at the moment or in future, and some might be the TNI's involvement in conflicts, particularly in the Papuan provinces. And as much as I don't want to reiterate that, because it is a well-trodden area, and it may be seen as an irritant, it is a reality of a human rights concern, and it's not one that we can wish away. And if we are to look at it, the media landscape in Indonesia and value and encourage a space for freedom of conversation, freedom of criticism, we must equally acknowledge that in our country as well. So again, not a roadblock, but perhaps another area of conversation about what are the ways in which we are prepared to have a national conversation about certain issues, the extent to which we're prepared for that in a whole of nation way to deepen our cooperation, a security cooperation with one of our most important strategic neighbours. On that basis, I do want to pick up on this point on a 1.5 track mechanism. I am very encouraged by the fact that this is intended to be an inclusive mechanism, particularly to incorporate voices from civil society. And I do want to highlight even the idea of training being inclusive. And importantly, I want to say in the report on page 13, the idea that the inclusive approach is important not only to prevent the monopolization of hybrid threat expertise by the TNI, but reflects the reality that building resistance against hybrid threats is a whole of society effort. So I want to commend Gatra and Euan for paying attention to that as well, because certainly the narrowing of space of conversation and criticism also does prevent a little bit of that societal, civil society input, potentially on the Indonesian side, to how might these threats be talked about, how they might be conceptualized, and ultimately how they might dealt with in a whole of society approach. But just on that 1.5, any kind of these mechanisms as well, the 1.5 track dialogue I thought was a great idea. But what I want to sort of point out is that in my experience of having participated in these 1.5 track dialogues as a member of ASPI or as a member of academia, is really the follow-up mechanism. It's really great to come together for these opportunities, swap business cards, to start a conversation, but it's about sustaining that conversation and sustaining that kind of collaboration. So in the spirit of John having proposed a variation of something that we already have working well with Indonesia, how might we then look at mechanisms like ICAHAN, which is our Defense Alumni Organization, which has the ability to sustain relationships, to sustain points of contact between members of our defense forces and defense bureaucracies. I know that this is a very expensive endeavor and it's taken 13 years, 11, 12 years to put together. But how might these mechanisms of socialization and sustained contact be then applied to other areas of a hybrid security relationship, hybrid threat focused security relationship? So again, acknowledging that these things take time and resources, but I think the success of ICAHAN is this idea of being able to maintain rather than just bring together people for what is inherently a very time-intensive and resource-intensive endeavor as well. The other area I want to point out is the evolving civil-military relationship in Indonesia. Many of us today, we know that there have been changes to the TNI law in the past 6 months, and there is an increasing I would say, prominence of the TNI in certain areas, although that has already been pre-existing. I think this might be something that I would invite the authors to consider. To what extent would the evolving civil-military relationship context in Indonesia impact our ability to work on hybrid threats together? Noting already you've talked about the way in which the military might monopolize conceptualizations of hybrid theories. What other areas would we need to think about? How might they have a relationship with the National Police at the moment, now that the champion of the National Police, Jokowi, is increasingly being politically sidelined, and there is a turnover of generals as well? And last but not least, I want to shine a light on the area of professional military education. We've talked about, I think in your report, you also mentioned the importance of language competence. I think it's not just language competence that we need to build within organizations like the ADF. I'm just going to pick defense as the example here, but as someone full disclosure, as someone who's invested in Australia's professional military education sphere, I'm someone who's a course convener at the Australian Command and Staff College and senior course. The idea of deepening our understanding of Indonesia through politics, history, and culture, I think, is essential, because that helps us then build a leadership and also leaders within civil society who have an instinctive understanding of Indonesia. We may be able to help engender that on the Indonesian side, but we need to look at ourselves first and say, well, if we're heading in this way, particularly in elements of society that will be working closely with Indonesia, what kind of mechanisms can we provide to help there be a shared sense of, a shared understanding of Indonesia on our side, but a deeper and more nuanced way of looking at our nearest neighbour? And last but not least, not just on the PME side, but broader education side as well, coming back to the democracy piece, I do want to highlight the case of South Korea, which might be a little bit unusual here, but we are talking about militaries, and we are talking about militaries and security institutions in an Indo-Pacific where we are experiencing A, democratic backsliding, and B, evolving civil-military relations as well. And part of the reason that the attempted self-coup in South Korea failed in December was what political scientists say, that there was a democratic capital there amongst the public and amongst the military who were willing to disregard what were unlawful orders and to stand by ethical considerations as well. To what extent are we engendering these kinds of considerations in society as we come up against very complex hybrid threats? How can we do that first in our own country, and then how can we look for opportunities in Indonesia as well? That might be a lot more aspirational, but I think since we're having a theoretical conversation based on something very concrete, these are also concrete considerations in places that were long-established democracies. So with that, I will look forward to hearing your responses, and I congratulate you again on a very fascinating and clear-eyed report as well.
Natalie, thank you so much, and thanks for a set of three very, very thoughtful questions and comments. Gatra and Euan, we have a few minutes, so I want to make sure that you have some time to respond to at least the questions that you got, and maybe some of the ideas and comments that you heard. And while they are speaking, I'm going to encourage everybody who is listening, if you do have a question you'd like to ask of our panel, feel free to add the Q&A now. We'll be able to filter that and post it immediately. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you've already heard enough from me, so I'll be very brief, but all of that was good. I'll absorb it in slower time, and maybe in some of our follow-up engagement, engage in more detail in some of those recommendations. On Fitri's questions, why would Indonesia prioritize Australia compared relative to other states? Well, I think the empirical evidence so far from the Prabowo administration is that Indonesia is going to pursue these multiple courting opportunities in parallel, compared to China, for example, Australia cannot compete in scale, and in Russia we've seen 2 visits, one pre-president, one post-president. So I think that is a wake-up call that we're not going to be ahead of that queue. Maybe the US factor aids us in a way, that Australia is seen now as a sort of relative source of consistency on the allied spectrum, and less capricious than the Trump administration. There may be opportunities to engage from that point of view. I think John Gould's point was really sharp one, that there is not just an asymmetry in aspirations, but also in just the capacity of how we engage at the bureaucratic level, and the absence of a an Australia desk in the Australian system is something that I think it's a challenge for us to maybe take up. Gatra, I know you're travelling soon to Indonesia. It'd be interesting to get your perceptions on how that might be approached. On the second question, what strategic rationale would motivate Indonesia to support the Philippines? Well, as I said, it is a high bar, and I know John's skepticism there. I mean, I think to the extent that ASEAN does register as a priority still for Indonesia, I know that Prabowo is not personally invested so much in ASEAN compared to previous Indonesian leaders, but the whole premise that if you unless you hang together, you'll hang separately, very much applies, I think, in terms of the approach, particularly from China when it applies pressure on the South China Sea and other geopolitical issues. So it's really to make the diplomatic point that the Philippines does not exist in isolation within ASEAN. And I think that Indonesia's role as the primus inter pares, just to acknowledge that there is a collective interest. I think this is pushing against the grain. It's a sensitive point, but I think the Philippines does struggle often to get that sense of legitimacy within ASEAN, despite being a founder member. Maybe the way around this is the idea to pick up John's point about the setting up an Arafura Sea. I mean, I think that's great. If you've got the resources, the benefit of being host is you can decide who you invite. So it's not an either or in my point of view. But that comes down to the penny holders, the purse holders who might be on this call. Food for thought for them to take up. Natalie, I don't want to sideline your recommendations. I think they're probably best addressed more by Gatra on the hybrid side. But very much appreciate your underlining of the importance of the changing civil-military relationship, and that is trending in still I think a rather worrisome direction in Indonesia, but also the need to bring the Australian public alongside too. I think one of the faults of the Indonesia relationship, it's been elite driven, so that disconnect between what we do at the societal level is certainly a real one, and it's unfortunate that it's not just language on which we're falling up, just general competence and knowledge about Asia in general, but certainly Indonesia as the closest and biggest of our Asian neighbours does need more uplift. So thank you all. Gatra.
Thanks, Euan. I'll be very quick given the amount of time that we have, but thanks so much everyone for the comments and questions. Sadly, I don't think we'll have time to address each one of them in detail, but I think I'll probably focus more on comments from John and Natalie, given I think Euan has already answered yours, Fitri. Broadly, when we were thinking about the recommendations for the report, it was, I think we had an eye to capacity, to priorities, and to the political circumstances in the two countries at home. Obviously, I think hybrid threats is an important area of important issue, given again just how prominent it has become as a problem internationally. Right? Again, it's become increasingly employed by more and more states. Indonesia does recognize the notion that there are hybrid threats. I mean, there are Indonesian documents that do classify military, non-military threats. It's very broad. Interestingly, include things like natural disasters, for example. But John is right in that there is no single person who I think can naturally champion this within the Indonesian system or the Australian system as of yet. This is, I guess, where the track 1.5 idea comes in, and arguably you need still somebody to still champion that first. But the idea behind the track 1.5 was that it's meant to sort of help identify ways in which these domains do connect with each other. And because I'm sure those conversations happen at defense meetings, but then I think it'll be good to see open source people working in open sources, people working in media spaces, as Natalie has mentioned as well, collaborate and talk about the actual nature of the challenges in the information space, cyberspace, and so on. I think a track 0.5 at the very outset is still relatively low cost. It is a challenge trying to get something coming out of it. I mean, as you know, we've all participated in that space before. But having said that, I think again there is a precedence, at least in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia and Australia, where track 1.5 can be super useful. I mean, we see this a lot in Southeast Asia, where track 1.5 oftentimes where they stress test ideas before they get to higher levels, right? I do like the Euan idea. I mean, I think if we were to look at friends in Europe, for example, there is the Hybrid Threat Center in Helsinki model where we can, for example, have fellowships. Not necessarily, I mean, not for Indian Pacific per se, but maybe perhaps we can have fellowships, focused on the hybrid threats. I have been very conscious about Indonesia, sadly, regressing democratic institutions. Which is why, again, I sort of highlighted the importance of it being an inclusive process. And if this was an initiative, for example, pushed forward by the Australians, this would be something that I think this could be a principle that is highlighted. At this stage, there is still some degree of space to criticize, some degree of space to be open about ideas in Indonesia. I think it's important to sort of exploit that opportunity right now, get key thought leaders in, and perhaps see a way we can move forward.
Just very briefly on the 1.5 track, to flag that ASPI does have an existing role participating in 1.5s that are run with the Department of Defence. So that's something that we could actively think about bringing onto the agenda when the next opportunity comes with our Indonesian counterparts.
Thank you, Euan. We're just about out of time, but I do see two questions. If we do have any space at all and people can stick around, I'd like to get to those. The first one I'd like to start with is actually a question for you, Natalie. I think your comments got people thinking. And a question to you directly would be, how can Indonesia and Australia work together more effectively to build trust and address shared security challenges in the Indo-Pacific? Maybe just a couple thoughts about that. And then immediately afterwards, perhaps go back to you and Gatra to talk about what John Blassland is asking. And that is, beyond the Philippines, is there an appetite or scope for including other countries in the region? Malaysia, Singapore, New Zealand, perhaps others into this mix. Natalie?
Thanks very much, Greg, and thanks to Hatem for the question. Look, trust is a really difficult thing to lose, and a very, very painstaking, very easy thing to lose and a very difficult thing to foster over time. And I think Australia, Indonesia, I'm going to draw on my expertise in the PME space, and I defer to Pak John on the broader relationship. The people-to-people ties, I think, have been very helpful. I think we have variable success in maintaining those really long-standing ties between individuals in defence establishments. I think Pak John mentioned the idea of Prabowo Subianto and Shafri Shamsuddin as being people who have familiarity with Australia, thanks to the 1974 ACMEL exchange. I think we are still patchy on comprehensively maintaining some of those staff college relationships where we have people for an entire year, or at the DSSC level where we have people for an entire year. There's a feeling amongst some of the overseas course members that their Australian colleagues don't really appreciate the fact that they're around. They don't feel as incorporated into the community. And so perhaps going back and looking over, well, where have we made an investment as an organization, bringing them across, bringing their family across, and how can we impress upon their Australian class members this is a rare opportunity and a critical one that they can play by very simple means of incorporating and being more inclusive, not just in word, but in deed. So I would put that forward.
Thank you. How about the expansion, potential expansion?
Well, I can take that in the first instance. Great to have you on the call, John. I know you've been diligently pushing the Manis idea for several years. I mean, I think it's evident those three countries are all in the five-power defence arrangements, which we do reference in the report as being the longest and most established of Australia's engagements in Southeast Asia. I think with that, you might be pushing up against a couple of areas of resistance from Malaysia and Singapore itself to expansion. I think they tend to be quite protective about the FPDA as something that is peninsula-centric in its approach. That said, Indonesia has been an observer for several years to FPDA exercises. The FPDA is enjoying a resurgence at the moment, so there is certainly room to work there. I also wonder about Prabowo's willingness to bring the other Southeast Asians into the mix. Maybe that's the point to test. My instinct says he might be a little bit resistant too, but fundamentally, this comes back to resourcing. If Australia is willing to resource this kind of idea, it gets it has the privilege of being the person that does the inviting. So I think getting Southeast Asians to work more together is precisely the logic that drives our recommendation on the Philippines, and that applies equally to Singapore, Malaysia, and for that matter, New Zealand. So thanks for the idea.
Thanks, John. Also, I've been following your work, including the Manus idea. I do love the acronym. As probably give sort of a perspective from how Indonesia would sort of see the proposal. Generally, Indonesia is not allergic to the idea of unilaterals, including security unilaterals, as long as firstly they're relatively state actor agnostic, and secondly there's a common security concern. So as Dr. Fitriani has mentioned earlier on, there's already that Sulawesi triangle, the cooperation in Sulawesi involving the Philippines and Malaysia. So in principle, I don't think Manus is something that Indonesia would necessarily go against. The question, of course, is what would they be collaborating on specifically, and how could they add to the already many existing defense arrangements or defense initiatives and activities that the Indonesian government, Indonesia already faces. Capacity has already been said to be an issue. Resourcing, of course, if Australia was to resource this, maybe it could work out. But the other side to the coin is, does Indonesia have space in its already very busy defense calendar to add more defense activities? We do know that, for example, with expanding defense ties with China and Russia, has had to push out exercises and initiatives with other countries as well. So already that's become an issue. But I think, again, in principle, it's not a bad idea.
Terrific. Gatra, Euan, thank you, and congratulations on a terrific report. We look forward to putting it into many people's hands here in DC. I think what we started here is not the end of the conversation just tonight, but actually the start of a bigger and broader conversation to be had. I want to thank our three discussants for joining us tonight. Fitriani, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Natalie, John, great to see you again as well. And especially thank you to those who joined from Canberra, from elsewhere in Australia or the region, and here from the United States. When we thank you for joining us, for giving us questions. I also want to have a shout out to my colleague Patrick for setting this up tonight. We'll see you at the next one. Everybody take care and good night or good morning.